floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from South Dakota.
Mr. President, the American credit card is maxed out. We continue to add about $1 trillion or $1.5 trillion to that credit card every single year, to where it's now at $14 trillion. And the amazing thing, Mr. President, is right now it's about noon here, and between now and midnight tonight, when this continuing resolution expires, and if nothing is done, the government would shut down, we will add more than $2 billion to that debt. In a 12-hour time period, between noon right now and midnight tonight, we will add another more than $2 billion to that $14 trillion debt that's growing literally by the hour. And so we have a crisis in this country. And we've had experts tell us, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, say that there's a 50% probability that we will see a debt crisis in the next 2 to 3 years. Now, just interestingly enough, there was a story this morning in the Wall Street Journal that says Europe's central bank became the first monetary authority in a major developed economy to raise interest rates since the global financial crisis struck, a sign that an era of cheap credit is coming to a close. And then it goes on to say the ECB increased its benchmark by 1/4 point to 1.25%. Now, Mr. President, if we started to see an upward tick in interest rates, it would have profound impact on the deficit and on the debt, because the experts also tell us, the Congressional Budget Office and others, that for every 1 percentage point increase in interest rates, it would cost about $140 billion every single year. Now, to put that into perspective, the interest on the debt in the year 2015, if we stay on our current trajectory, will exceed the amount that we spend for defense. So we will be spending more on interest on the debt than we actually spend defending this country in 2015. Now, that's assuming we don't see any kind of an increase in interest rates. But if we were to see, as I said earlier, as much as a 1% increase in interest rates, that adds $140 billion every single year in interest costs to finance the debt. This is a serious situation which requires serious action. Now, we have in front of us a continuing resolution to fund the government because we didn't get the work done last year. The Democrat majorities here in the Congress last year did not pass a budget, didn't pass a single appropriation bill. And so we are doing the unfinished work of last year. We're in the now 6th continuing resolution, which, as I said, expires tonight at midnight. If nothing is done, the government would shut down. But there's an alternative, Mr. President. And of course, the best alternative would be to pass legislation that passed the House of Representatives earlier this year, was voted on in the Senate and defeated, that would cut $61 billion from discretionary spending and take us back to 2008 levels. And if just to remind my colleagues, in the last 2 years, discretionary spending has increased 24%. That's if you don't include stimulus money. If you add stimulus money, it was 84%. We've seen discretionary spending increase in the last 2 years by 24% at a time when inflation in this country was 2%. So we were spending at a rate that was literally more than 10 times the rate of inflation. I don't think the American people would think it's unreasonable when you're running $1.5 trillion deficits every year, when you have a $14 trillion debt, to think that we ought to be able to go back to 2008 spending levels. That is what the House bill did that failed here in the Senate, and so that triggered a negotiation which is ongoing. But my point very simply, Mr. President, is there is a solution in front of us now that would prevent at midnight tonight the government from shutting down. And it would also fund our troops through the end of this fiscal year, which ends on September 30th. So all we have to do here in the Senate is the majority leader, all he has to do is call up that House-passed bill. We move that. It would fund the government for another week until the negotiators can come to a final conclusion on a longer-term funding resolution that would take us through to the end of the fiscal year. It's very simple. There's a very simple answer to all this. And so there's a big debate about that particular short-term funding resolution. They say, well, maybe it cuts too deeply. Well, all the cuts that are in that short-term funding resolution are cuts that have been agreed upon largely by both sides, by both Democrats and Republicans. And it's to the tune of about $12 billion, which is significantly less than the number that both sides have agreed we ought to cut from the budget this year. It also, as I said, would fund the military, really important that we fund our troops, that we not put our military, when we're trying to fight 2 wars and perhaps 3, at risk of not having the funding that's necessary for them to conduct their very important duties. And so it would fund the military through the end of this fiscal year. So why will it not be picked up and passed by the majority leader here in the United States Senate? Well, according to our colleagues on the other side, it is because of these ideological riders, this rigid partisanship, this insisting upon things that just absolutely don't have any support here in the United States Congress. Well, I want to point out something that in 2009, the other side was singing a very different tune, because at that time they were passing a big spending bill, and at that time President Obama and then Speaker Pelosi loaded such riders onto a government funding bill similar to the one now being negotiated. And a senior Democrat aide is saying, well, they're not comparable. Well, many of the same provisions, in fact, one of them was an abortion provision that was included in that particular spending bill. And what goes on here to say, and this is quoting a Democrat aide later on, there is a difference between including riders on a bill when they are supported by a majority of the Senate and just need a vehicle, and including riders on a bill because a minority is trying to ram through something that would not have support on its own. Well, just to point out, the rider that was added by the House Republicans on the short-term spending bill is a ban on taxpayer funding of abortions here in Washington, D.C. It would affect 1 city in the country. And interestingly enough, Mr. President, it is a position that has been supported repeatedly by the leadership on the other side. The majority leader, Senator Reid, has voted for this very ban 10 times since 1995. The majority whip, Senator Durbin, has voted for this very ban 9 times since 1995. And, believe it or not, the President of the United States, when he was a member of the United States Senate, voted for that ban twice. And he has, as President, signed legislation that includes that ban. And so to suggest that this is something that lacks majority support just doesn't pass the smell test. You cannot make an argument that it's about ideological riders that don't have majority support when you have people on both sides by large majorities voting for these particular riders. And I think you can't argue that this is an ideological battle, because these are things that have been passed before right here in the United States Senate. And I think that most of these, a lot of legislative things, a lot of things that get funded in government are an expression of someone's ideology. Now, there are some of us who happen to believe that the taxpayers in this country should not be supporting abortion. So that taxpayer funds shouldn't be going to supporting abortions. And the broader debate about funding for Planned Parenthood is not just ideological, it is a funding issue, because they've received somewhere on the order of over $300 million a year in taxpayer funds. So when you're looking at ways to trim government, you're looking at every area of the budget, you are by definition making decisions that in some cases may be based on someone's ideology. But the fact of the matter is, you cannot argue with a straight face here on the floor of the United States Senate that this short-term funding resolution ought to be held up over a couple of riders that have broad support by members on both sides and have countless votes, previous votes, in support of those. And so I would suggest to my colleagues here in the Senate that a shutdown at midnight tonight can be avoided very simply. All it requires is for the majority leader to pick up the bill that passed the House of Representatives yesterday, that, as I said, funds the government for another week until our negotiators can come to that final conclusion, that funds the military through the end of the fiscal year, and that includes a couple of provisions that have been supported numerous times by members on both sides here in the United States Senate. A shutdown is totally unavoidable, but it's completely up to the majority to pick up that legislation and pass it. Now, we can't afford to wait to deal with out-of-control spending and debt for the reasons that I just mentioned. Over 40 cents of every dollar that we spend at the federal level is borrowed. As I said before, we've seen discretionary spending increase by 24% over the past 2 years. What the House Republicans have proposed in terms of spending reductions, I think by any definition, I think the American people would find it to be very, very reasonable. It represents literally less than 2% of total federal spending. At a time when most Americans are tightening their belts, most small businesses are tightening their belts, families are having to make hard budget decisions, at least here in Washington, we ought to be making decisions that are in the best interest of getting this country back on track so that we aren't spending money that we don't have, so that we are living within our means, and so that we aren't saddling future generations with an enormous burden of debt, which isn't fair to them, and which, by the way, also has a profound impact on the economy. Everybody makes the argument up here that somehow if we reduce federal spending that it's going to hurt the economy. Well, I would argue the opposite. If we don't get federal spending under control, it's going to hurt the economy. Because you're going to see these kinds of impacts. You're going to see interest rates start going up, you're going to see inflation start going up, and you're going to have people not making decisions about hiring out there in our economy because they don't believe that Washington, D.C. has gotten the message about getting spending and debt under control. And so I would argue to my colleagues, Mr. President, that we have a solution, a very simple solution in front of us. It certainly doesn't necessitate at midnight tonight the government shutting down. I don't think that's in anybody's best interest. I don't know of anybody on this side of the aisle who wants to see that happen. All we're simply saying is it is high time that this government started to live within its means, started to stop spending money that it doesn't have, and starts putting us on a fiscal path that will ensure that this country is around for future generations of Americans and that we don't have young people in the future carrying around an $88,000 debt, which is what their debt will be in a few short years if we don't take steps to get federal spending and federal debt under control. So I urge my colleagues, and I would ask the senator from New York got up and said, please, Republicans, don't shut the government down. I would say to my colleagues on the other side, it's very simple. The majority leader just picks up the House-passed bill, passes it, and this crisis is averted. And the negotiators can continue their discussions on a longer-term solution, which it sounds like they're very close to coming to a conclusion on. That's all that it would require. It's a very simple solution, and I hope that my colleagues will do it and that we can make sure the government continues to function, but that we start to get spending and debt under control. Mr. President, I